Hey, welcome to the introductory episode of Operational Velocity. I'm going to start off this podcast episode and series with a bit of a controversial statement. Every business has a theory, a vision, a market opportunity, and a pitch deck that explains in about 12 slides exactly why this company is going to win. However, most of them are wrong. Not wrong about the market, not wrong about the opportunity, not wrong about the mechanism, or wrong about what actually moves the numbers. But when you look at the businesses that generate disproportionate returns, and I mean the ones that compound, the ones that sustain, and the ones that are still standing and still growing when everyone else has run out of vision and run out of runway, those businesses have one thing in common. They operate well. Not brilliantly, not perfectly, not with some proprietary framework on the wall that nobody reads, but they operate with discipline, with velocity, and with an understanding that cash flow is not a financial outcome, it's an operational outcome. So welcome to Operational Velocity. My name is Gautam Basu, and I have been in operations for the last 35 years, both as a operator, practitioner, investor, and also spent some time in academia as a professor of practice at Aalto University. And some of you may know me from being the host of the Operations Leadership Podcast. And that was a show about operations, people, decisions, discipline, technology, and really how businesses actually work. So this is what comes next. So if operations leadership was built around a simple premise that the people who actually run things, the operators, the logistics heads, supply chain directors, COOs, plant managers, who never get the profile that they deserve, but those people are some of the most important and least understood figures in business. And in that series, we covered a lot. We covered things from supply chain structures, network design, artificial intelligence, supply chain risk, so on and so forth. And when we think about board governance and what it actually asks of an operations leaders, we also had conversations with people who have spent careers building the infrastructures that make that commerce possible. And I'm proud of that work. But I think there needs to be a continuation, not because the content ran out, but because the conversation needs to move somewhere harder. So if operations leadership answer the question, what do operators do? Operational velocity is going to answer a different question, a more uncomfortable one. What does operations actually produce? And we're not talking about output or units shipped or orders processed or on-time delivery rates. I mean, what does a well-run operation produce in terms that the people who own the businesses, invest in the businesses, and sit on the boards of these businesses actually care about? And in my view, this is focused on cash, margin, velocity, the capacity to do more with the same, the ability to absorb a shock without going backwards. And this is what this show is about. It's the relationship between operational discipline, rigor, and value creation. And this is not an abstract argument as a documented, evidence-based, practitioner-tested truth. And we're going to approach it through four lenses, four ways of seeing the same thing. So let me walk you through them. Let's start with the thing most people get wrong. When someone asks you how businesses create value, you get one of two answers. First is a product answer. We build something people want and they pay us for it. And the second is a financial answer. We structure our capital efficiently and generate returns above our cost of capital. And I guess both answers are partially right, but I would also say they're kind of useless as well because neither of them tells you how. And we're talking about the mechanism, the actual machine that converts inputs into outputs, that converts inventory into cash, that converts labor and equipment and floor space and technology into something a customer actually receives. That machine is operations. And if it runs badly, nothing else works. If it runs well, everything is easier. So let me give you a number. A typical manufacturing business has a cash conversion cycle, the time between spending money on inputs and receiving money from customers, of somewhere between 45 to 75 days. Best-in-class operators run it at 20 days or less. And that gap, 25 to 55 days of working capital, is not a finance problem. It's an operations problem. It is inventory turns, it is receivables management, it is the procurement terms negotiated by someone who understands both the supply chain and the balance sheet. And that gap, compressed, is cash, free, on tap, self-generated cash that reduces dependence on external capital, funds reinvestment, and compounds over time. So companies like Zara figured this out before most people were talking about it. Their model, designed to shelf in 2 weeks, high inventory turns, minimal markdown risk, is not a fashion strategy. It is an operational strategy that happens to express itself through fashion. The margin their supply chain generates is not a byproduct of good design. It is the design. And here's the broader truth. Every financial metric you care about, whether it's gross margin, EBITDA margin, return on capital employed, free cash flow conversion, has an operational driver upstream of it, always, without exception. So a gross margin is a function of procurement, yield, and waste. EBITDA margin is a function of labor efficiency, asset utilization, and overhead absorption. And free cash flow conversion is a function of working capital discipline. And return on capital employed is a function of how hard you make your assets work. And I would argue that none of these are finance problems. They are operations problems wearing finance clothes. You can think of it like this. A CFO reports a number, the operator moves it. Those are not the same job, and it matters enormously which one you put in charge of improving it. And this show is going to document that mechanism, not in theory, but in practice, with specific decisions, the specific levers, and the specific results that separate an operation running at 70% of its potential from one that's running at 95% or above. Because that gap, 70 to 95, is where enterprise value is made or lost. And almost nobody talks about it plainly enough. The second lens we're going to look at through this podcast series is about people. I love people. Specifically, the people and a particular type of leader that doesn't get nearly enough attention. We have an entire genre of business media built around founders, the visionaries, the product people, the one who saw something nobody else saw and built a company around it. Look, I read those books, I enjoy those podcasts, but I think we've systematically underinvested in studying a different type of leader, one whose edge is not imagination, but execution. And this is what I call the operations first leader. These are the people whose primary competitive advantage is understanding how things actually work. They've been on the floor, they built the systems, they know why the numbers move. And when they take the top job or a board seat or operating partner role, they bring clarity of cause and effect that changes how the organization sees itself. Let me give you a couple of examples. Tim Cook, before he was Apple CEO, he was Apple COO, operations chief. He was a person who dismantled Apple's manufacturing footprint, outsourced it to a network of Asian suppliers, and built the most disciplined supply chain in consumer electronics history. And when Steve Jobs gave him the job, it wasn't because Cook had the most creative vision for Apple's future or he was the best product design guy. It was because Jobs understood that the machine needed to run with precision and that only an operator could deliver. And if you look at the results, Apple's margins consistently the highest in consumer hardware or an operations story, full stop. Another guy, Alan Mulally, was part of the Ford company. And when Ford hired him from Boeing in 2006, the company was burning through cash and losing market share on 2 continents. And he didn't come in with a product revolution. He came in with a process. One Ford, one plan, one team. And Mulally, he made the senior leadership team show up every week with a color-coded scorecard, green, yellow, red. And he didn't punish red. he punished the people who called red green. And that's an operations mind applied to a leadership system. And the result was that Ford was the only Detroit automaker that didn't need a government bailout in 2009. Another operations leader, one who I admire very greatly, is Lou Gerstner at IBM. I was an IBMer for about 6.5, 7 years of my career. And Gerstner, he's remembered for saving IBM from irrelevance. And what's less remembered is how. He didn't invent a new product category. He didn't pivot the company to a new market. He fixed the operation. He decentralized pricing authority to the field. He rebuilt the service delivery model, and he made IBM's global infrastructure legible to itself. The transformation was operational before it was strategic. And the pattern, when you look at across enough cases, is fairly consistent. Operations first leaders don't just run businesses more efficiently. They see businesses differently. They see through the org chart to the system underneath it. And that, my friends, is a capability that compounds over time, because systems thinking is the ability to understand how inputs become outputs across a complex organization. And it's not a skill that degrades with seniority, it sharpens. This show is going to profile some of those leaders as case studies. And we're going to examine specific decisions, specific operational choices, and trace them forward to their consequences on cash flow, on margin, and on organizational resilience. Because I think operations first leaders are the most important under-exam figures in business. And I want to build a body of evidence that makes the case undeniable. Lens number 3 is about technology. And it's not the way technology usually gets talked about in the business media, things like innovation, disruption, competitive threat to be managed, or opportunity to be seized. But I want to talk about it the way operators talk about it, which is, does it make the machine run better? And how do you know? So specifically, we're looking at technology as operational leverage. And because there is an enormous gap right now between what technology is being sold as in the boardroom or in management teams and what it is actually delivering on the floor. And I've talked about this in the Operations Leadership podcast, but it's worth noting again. There are some consultancy reports that state that fewer than 30% of companies that deploy AI at scale could demonstrate measurable financial impact. Not return on investment, but a measurable impact. And the majority of AI implementations are either too early in deployment to show results, too narrowly scoped to move material metrics, or too disconnected from operational workflow to generate anything other than a productivity experiment in a corner of an organization that nobody may be watching. So let me be clear, I am not making an anti-technology argument. I am making a pro-rigor argument. Technology creates operational leverage when and only when it is deployed against a specific operational constraint with a clear metric by people who understand both the technology, the operation, and the process. And when any of those 3 or 4 conditions are missing, you get a pilot program. And you may generate a case study, but it will die quietly in the next budget cycle. Let's talk about a positive case where it's actually been done right. And if you look at, for example, Amazon's fulfillment network, which runs on a warehouse management system, or WMS, that's really, really tightly integrated with demand forecasting and its carrier network, so that the average pick-to-ship time in a modern Amazon fulfillment center is measured in hours. So it's not so much the software, although it helps. It's the operational design expressed through the software technology. So the point is, the technology is inseparable from the operational logic it was built to serve. You may want to also think about considering the shift happening right now in industrial maintenance. Predictive maintenance, this kind of maintenance that uses IoT or sensor data and machine learning to anticipate equipment failures before they happen, has been a technology story for about a decade. And it is only now becoming an operations story, as the companies with enough historical data and enough operational discipline to act on predictions are seeing asset utilizations improvements of anywhere between 8 to 15%. And that's not a small number in an asset-heavy business. That's the difference between returns that justify the capital investment and the returns that don't. So the point here that technology is not operational leverage by default. It only becomes operational leverage when an operator decides where to point it and what to measure when it gets there. And that's a distinction that matters more than anything else in this conversation right now. Because we know that every company is being pressured right now by its board, by its investors, by its competitors to deploy AI, to automate, to digitize. And the companies that will generate returns from that pressure are not the ones that deploy fastest. They are the ones that deploy most deliberately. And this podcast, Operational Velocity, is going to track that. We're going to look at where technology is generating real operational leverage in supply chains, in warehouse systems, in transport systems, in demand planning, in workforce management. And we're going to be honest about where it isn't. Because let's face it, the hype serves no one and the evidence serves everyone. And the last main lens we're going to look at is private equity and the operating model. And I want to be precise about what I mean by that and what I don't mean. I'm not interested in private equity as a financial model, although it's important. What I mean is the mechanics of leverage, the structure of the deal, the dynamics of the exit, that content exists in abundance. And there are people who know it far better than I do, and the stuff is out there. What I'm specifically interested in is what private equity has taught us about operational urgency. Because private equity has a feature that most other ownership structures lack, a clock. What I mean specifically is a hold period, typically anywhere between 5 to 7 years, and this creates a discipline that permanent capital rarely imposes. You see, you can't wait for the market to improve, and you cannot defer the operational transformation to next year's planning cycle. You have a defined window, and within that window, you have to do something real to the underlying business. And something that is visible in the numbers, something that justifies the multiple. This created a role that didn't exist before private equity scaled, and that's the operating partner. And someone whose job is it not to do deals, but to build the operational capacity that makes deals worth doing. Those specific people in those roles, and some of the most interesting ones, are the ones we'll be bringing onto this show. And we're going to develop a practitioner-level understanding of how to move operational metrics fast, under constraint, and with accountability. And I hope that knowledge can be somewhat generalizable. You don't need to be a PE back to benefit from it. You just need to understand the operating partner's mental model of the business as a system of operational metrics, as leading indicators of financial outcomes, of management bandwidth, as a rate limiter on transformation. And that, I believe, is applicable to any business that is serious about continuous improvement or Kaizen. We're going to hear from those people, and we'll examine their decisions, and we'll do our best to extract the thinking that is useful to anyone running a business, whether or not a fund has a stake in it. So there we have it. 4 lenses, 1 thesis. Value creation through operations, the mechanism behind every financial metric that matters. Operations first leaders, the people who see through the org chart to the system underneath. Technology as operational leverage, not innovation for its own sake, but precision deployment against specific constraints. And last but not least, private equity and the operating model, which is the urgency and discipline of a clock and what it produces when applied to an operation that's ready for it. I also want to be clear about what this show is not going to be. It's not going to be a collection of interesting conversations with no through line. Every episode, solo or guest, is going to be built around an argument, a specific, testable, evidence-based argument about how operations create value. At least that's my goal. I'm going to do my best to leave you with each episode with something you can think about, push back on, or apply. And hopefully I'm not going to tell you what you already know. If you spent any time in an operational role or private equity environment or line management or running a business that you've acquired, you already know that execution matters. You don't need this show to make that case. But what you may need is to go a bit deeper to give you the language, the evidence, and perhaps some of the frameworks that makes that case yourself in rooms where people still think finance creates more value and operations is a cost center. Let me be clear. Operations is not a cost center. It's a cash generator, a risk absorber, a competitive moat, and the most reliable source of sustainable margin in any business that makes, moves, or delivers something. That, my friends, is the argument, and we're going to spend the next season proving it. And here's what I want to leave you with. Somewhere right now, there's a business running at 70% of what it could be. Not because the market is wrong, not because the strategy is wrong, but because the operations is wrong. Because inventory is sitting in the wrong place, or capacity is being allocated to the wrong output, or cash is moving through the system too slowly to fund the next decision before it has been made. And the people who own that business, or who are about to acquire it, or who are trying to grow it, or having conversations about vision and strategy and market positioning, while the answer is sitting on the floor, in the data, in the gap between what the system is capable of and what is currently delivering. And that gap is not a mystery, it's a measurement problem. And the measurement problems have solutions. And that is what this show is about. Not inspiration, not frameworks you read once and forget, but specific, documented, evidence-based answers to the questions that actually matter. So how do you make an operation run fast enough to change the financial outcome? We're going to attempt to answer that question. And through the decisions that operators have made, the leaders who understood what others didn't, and the technologies that are right now in real businesses compressing the distance between input and cash. Not theory, velocity. So this is Gautam Basu, and I'm really excited to start this series of Operational Velocity. Subscribe wherever you listen. If you know somebody who needs this conversation, send it to them. Take care.